Welcome to What is Next? What is Next is a very educative program raising contemporary challenges, questions confronting us as a nation and seeking relevant answers as to what we need to do next to build this dear country of ours. Now, this afternoon, I have a man who has remained a symbol of anti-corruption, a strong advocate when it comes to matters of transparency and accountability. I'm talking about Justice Francis Emile Short as my special guest for What is Next. This is GTV, the authentic and trusted voice of Ghana. We will be back very soon. And when we come back, my special guest will help us to answer the question, what is next? Welcome back. This is What is Next. And as I mentioned earlier on, our special guest this afternoon is a man who has remained a symbol of anti-corruption. Justice Francis Emile Short. Justice, welcome to What is Next.
Thank you.
We are so grateful you've accepted to be with us.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Will you help my viewers to understand the man behind Justice Emile Short?
Well,
Who is Justice Emile Short?
I don't really like to talk about myself, but maybe for the benefit of younger listeners who do not know me, and particularly during the period I was in public office, I'll say a few things about myself. I'm from Cape Coast. I went to school in St. Augustine's. And then I went abroad to read law. So by profession, I'm a lawyer, and I'm also a retired judge. And in 1993, President Rawlings appointed me to be the head of the Commission on Human Rights and Administrative Justice. And I held that position from 1993 until in 2004, I was appointed a judge to sit on the United Nations International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and that is the judicial body that was trying people who had been implicated in the genocide of 1994 in Rwanda. I came back in 2010 and retired from the Commission on Human Rights and Administrative Justice. So in brief, that is my personal biography, unless you want me to address something specific. You know.
Yeah, but growing up, what were some of the values that shape your worldview, that shape values that you don't want to let go?
Well, I would say that my dad was my mentor. My dad was, actually he was from Sierra Leone, but he migrated to Ghana and spent quite a large part of his life in Cape Coast. And he was a lawyer, and so he influenced my career. And he was a strict disciplinarian. He imbibed in all the children values of honesty, integrity, hard work. You know, he always cautioned us to always speak the truth. And he always spoke about the law of karma. And the law of karma is the same thing as in the Bible where it talks about you reap what you sow. So he always told us that we should avoid evil and always do good. So he placed a premium on honesty, on hard work, on contentment, and also on ensuring that we are disciplined, you know. So these are some of the values that I imbibed during my youth, which helped me in my work, especially when I went to study law in England, because things were very difficult when I went to England, and so I had been prepared to face the storms of life in England by virtue of the kind of values that my dad had inculcated in me, especially he tried not to spoil us, you know. He wanted to make sure we have just enough to make ends meet, but not to give us too much, you know. I remember when I was in St. Augustine's, on Saturdays, we get exits to go to town, you know. And there were a few students whose parents were quite rich, and so they would go and take their father's car, then they would bring it onto the school, and they would drive around, screech around, and, you know, try to impress others. And I wanted to do the same thing. My father said, no. He did not encourage me to engage in any behavior that would detract from my concentration on my studies. So he told me that that is not the kind of thing that he would encourage, you know. I should focus on my studies and make sure that I am not distracted by sort of things which other students were doing, you know. So my dad shaped my values, you know. My dad was a civil engineer, but because he was being persecuted, at a late time in his life, he decided to go and do law. So when he did law in England, he came back to Cape Coast to practice law. And I remember that there were people who were encouraging him to, in addition to his legal practice, to get contracts to do civil engineering work. But he said no, he was quite content with his private legal practice. So one of the lessons he taught us was to be content with what we have, you know, and not to avoid the love of money. You know, the Bible talks about the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, you know. And my father was always preaching to us, you know. He spoke about a lot of the values that are espoused in the Bible, and he was a staunch Catholic, and so of course, therefore I went to Catholic schools, and although later on I changed and moved into the Pentecostal and Charismatic movement, where I am at the moment. So my dad has been my mentor. He was my mentor, and also my values were shaped by, you know, going to Catholic schools, and then recently, of course, I am more in the Pentecostal and Charismatic movement.
Mm-hmm. Justice, according to the 2018 Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, Ghana relatively is low when compared to other Africa countries. We are 78th least corrupt country out of about 180 countries. Does that give us a reason to celebrate?
Not at all. It should cause for concern, because 78, in other words, one is the best country, okay, which is occupied by Denmark. Now, there are 9 African countries that are better than Ghana. For example, the Seychelles ranks 28. So there are 50 positions below Ghana, and we should be ashamed of that. But Botswana ranks 34. So there are 9 countries, Botswana, Rwanda, and Rwanda, for example, which ranks 48, was a country that was devastated by the genocide in 1944. A lot of the institutions were destroyed and they had to start from scratch. So the fact that they have been able to transform their society in such a very relatively quick time demonstrate that the effort they have put into ensuring transparency and accountability, in their country. So I think that it is cause for concern that we are 78, and it is true that there are many other countries who we are better than. But of course we must set high standards. We must not set mediocre standards for this country. And we share the position of 78 with Burkina Faso. And our democracy has advanced a lot more than Burkina Faso. And so there should be a cause of concern that we are 78 on the 2018 International Transparency Corruption Index. And that is, we are 78 because of the corruption, the extent of the corruption in the country. And I could give quite a number of examples of what has made us at that level. If you would permit me, I can talk about a few. For example, political corruption. It is an open secret that the political parties, especially the 2 dominant political parties, the NPP and the NDC, bribe voters when they are campaigning for office. They distribute all manner of goodies like rice, flour, and so on. Some distribute television sets and all sorts of things to get voters to vote for them. That is corruption. It is very serious. Another incident of political corruption in the primaries which have been held recently by both parties. It is evident, it is public knowledge that candidates who are vying for political office have to pay the delegates. They have to bribe the delegates. So the highest bidder sort of wins. And the highest bidder may not be the most competent person. And this is also a form of corruption. And nobody is talking about it. In other words, the political leadership themselves are not condemning it. And so it is encouraged and it is continuing. Another aspect of political corruption, which I think is very serious, is the fact that people who are vying for political office, they have to find their own money to fund their campaign, okay? Now what happens is that since there is no public funding for campaign expenses, when they win and get into office, they find ways of stealing money from the public purse in order to recover their expenses. This is also public knowledge. And it is rumored that they even take more than what they have spent in their campaign expenses, so that in the long run, the public purse is exploited, by politicians who get into public office because they want to recover their expenses in their campaigns. And we have had discussions about this matter for quite a long time. there has been a suggestion that in the absence of party supporters paying dues to the political parties, which is not a culture that has been established in this country, we should consider public funding of political parties and candidates, But that's quite a controversial matter. And there was actually a draft public funding bill developed by the Institute of Economic Affairs, in 2008. But it did not see the light of day. But this is one of the options that we can consider to avoid the practice whereby politicians now raid the public purse to recover their campaign expenses.
Viewers, I'm in conversation with Justice Francis Emile Short. Now, he has admitted that even though it is true, the 2018 Transparency International Corruption Perception Index gives impression that as a country, we are relatively doing better if we compare ourselves with other Africa countries. But where we stand, the kind of maturity in our democracy, we should not set standards that suggest mediocrity for us. We can do better as a country, and that is where our focus must be. We must aim at excellence, not just comparing ourselves with countries with weaker structures, weaker governance systems. But Justice, we have institutions such as Commission on Human Rights and Administrative Justice, your own baby, let me put it that way, charged with investigating all alleged and suspected corruption and the misappropriation of public funds by government officials. We have Auditor General's Office, Serious Fraud Office, Economic and Organized Crime Office, and recently the Office of the Special Prosecutor. Should reports of corruption come to Ghanaians as a surprise?
Well, the Serious Fraud Office is now the same as the Economic and Organized Crime, office. The name has changed.
Okay.
But to answer your question, it should not come as a surprise because corruption is endemic in Ghana. It is widespread. It has permeated almost every sector of our society, And so we tolerate corruption. And so in spite of the existence of all of these institutions, even if they were operating at their best level, in other words, they were fully resourced and they had very competent staff and they were operating at maximum level, the fact of the matter is that corruption is so widespread that in spite of the existence of these institutions, it should not come as a surprise when we hear that there is corruption in various sectors of our society. Let me give you one example. If you look at the Auditor General's report, every year he catalogues multiple financial irregularities in almost all the ministries, departments, and agencies, and especially in the district assemblies. If you look at the 2018 report, which has just been submitted, it shows that there are all kinds of financial irregularities like procurement breaches, monies paid to public officers which have not been accounted for, salaries paid to people who have left institutions. In other words, people have resigned from the institutions and yet their institutions continue to pay them salaries. You find incidents of loans which have been taken and have not been recovered, they have not been paid. There are so many irregularities, you know. And the sad part of it is that there are no sanctions, and the Auditor General himself has lamented the fact that these breaches occur every year, but there are no sanctions imposed. So we have these breaches occurring repeatedly every year. So the fact of the matter is that there is so much corruption in our society that, notwithstanding the existence of all these institutions, it should not come as a surprise when we hear that there is corruption. I want to refer to today's daily graphic. I have it here. And if you look at today's daily graphic, it says that it's at page 19, it says favoritism, major cause of unemployment. This is a research study done by the Center for Policy Research with a youth organization, Youth for Human Rights. And what the conclusion of the research study is that the youth who are looking for employment, they say that they can only get employment depending on who you know. In other words, unless you know somebody in government or in a high public, occupying a high public office, your chances of getting employment are remote, you know. So favoritism is practiced, and there are a lot of people who come to me because they know that I have been in public office before, asking whether I can help them to get employment. And I ask them, why don't you apply? And they said, oh, if you apply, you're not going to get it unless you know somebody within the institution. So it's this favoritism, which amounts to corruption, is practiced, you know, widespread. And this is quite sad, you know. And this research study says that it is the cause of unemployment because people are not recruited on the basis of merit, on the basis of their competence, but on the basis of who they know, you know. The study also concludes that the political parties are really not interested in the public interest, but are actually promoting their own interest and the interest of their supporters and cronies. It's a sad conclusion by the youth, you know, and there is so much corruption at the moment that it has led the ambassadors of the Netherlands and Australia to express concern about the level of corruption recently. And it takes a lot of courage for ambassadors to enter this area of our life because normally they try not to comment on issues such as corruption. But because they are so concerned about the level of corruption, you know, both the Netherlands ambassador as well as the Australian ambassador, you know, recently have expressed concern about the level of corruption. And indeed, the Netherlands ambassador, during an event organized by the Ghana Integrity Initiative, suggested that in addition to the Ghana Beyond Aid mantra, we should also start talking about Ghana Beyond Corruption. You know, that we should aim at achieving a Ghana beyond corruption. And of course, there are a few people who criticized him for that, but I support the statement because I think that it is trying to draw our attention to the level of corruption in the society and to, try to encourage us to do much better than we're doing at the moment.
Justice, is corruption in Ghana a matter of social inequality? Is it poverty? Is it part of our culture? Is it an issue of ineffective leadership?
Well, it's a combination of some of what you have mentioned. It is a culture in the sense that it is tolerated. Indeed, it is the norm. In many developed countries, there is corruption, but it is not the norm, it is the exception. But in Ghana, it is the norm. And so it is tolerated and accepted. If you do not engage in it, then you are seen as somebody who is strange, So to an extent, it has become part of our life, and it has permeated almost all sectors of our body politic. In relation to poverty, corruption deepens poverty because resources which can be used for social services like, hospitals, infrastructure, roads, and so on, are diverted into the pockets of a few people. And so it deprives the people, the citizens, of many facilities and social facilities which otherwise government will have been able to provide. You see, so it deepens poverty. So that's the relation between corruption and poverty. It exacerbates poverty because there's less funds to provide social services and infrastructure development. In relation to leadership, corruption exists because of the absence of strong leadership, And I can give an example of Rwanda, which, as I indicated earlier, went through genocide in 1994 and President Kagame, who took over, stopped the genocide, has transformed the society so rapidly that it is now, and that transformation has occurred due to his leadership. He is a strong leader who is very disciplined, and he has a vision for his country, and he has made sure that his vision of a clean government and a clean society has trickled down from the top to the bottom. So because of his strong leadership, he has been able to ensure that corruption is at its minimum. So you'll see that from the Transparency International Corruption Index, Rwanda is 48, whilst we are 78, So gradually they're doing better every year, and they're way ahead of us. So leadership also has an important part to play in the fight against corruption. All of us have a role to play. In other words, you and I has a role to play, the public, the citizens. We have a role to report corruption and not to engage in corruption ourselves. We should be whistleblowers, reporting people who are engaged in corruption to the oversight institutions which you mentioned, the legislature, the executive, the judiciary, civil society. Everybody has a role to play. It's a collective effort, But leadership has a critical role to play. Leadership should set the example, And so the link between corruption and leadership is that a strong leadership would promote, anti-corruption. And that has been seen in places like, as I say, Rwanda, as well as Singapore. Singapore is a country that has we can, there are lessons which we can learn from Singapore, and if I have the opportunity, I will talk about how Singapore has been able to transform from a third world country to a first world country. In fact, if you look at this 2018 International Transparency Corruption Index, Singapore is third on the list, surpassing European countries like the UK, Japan, and so on. And it has done this because of the leadership style of Lee Kuan Yew. And Lee Kuan Yew has written a book entitled From Third World to First World. And he has a special chapter called Clean Government, where he describes the strategy that he adopted to bring Singapore from where Singapore was at the time he took office to where they are now. And if time permits, I could talk about the strategies that he used in order to achieve what he has achieved, so far. So I hope I'll get the opportunity
you will.
that.
Viewers, this is what is next, and I'm in conversation with Justice Francis Emile Shaw. Justice, you seem to be worried about the moral decadence in Ghana at the moment.
Yes, because it looks like, even the youth are being corrupted. Almost every year, we hear of exam question leakages, And what is sad about it is that parents are involved. Parents are buying exam questions which have been leaked for their children and wards. So they are corrupting their children from a very early stage. The educational authorities are involved, and it's that I find so disturbing, because these are the youth who we expect to be the leaders of the future, And so you find a lot of young people these days, they want to get rich quick. There is this 419 syndrome where the youth engage in all kinds of practices to make money, And so there is moral decadence, and we have not done enough to create a climate of integrity and honesty in our body politic. But I must admit that we have a national anti-corruption plan, a 10-year national anti-corruption plan, 2015 to 2024, which seeks to improve the moral fiber of the country. There are a number of activities in that plan which include SHRAJ, for example, developing anti-corruption materials for schools, ethics, code of ethics for schools. And SHRAJ has been in touch with the Ghana Education Service to incorporate these ethics materials into the curricula of the schools. But it has not yet succeeded in convincing the Ghana Education Service to do so. I understand Star Ghana has got a consultant who has also come up with the kind of ethical studies that can be included in the syllabus of schools at the JSS and SHS level. So there are efforts to try and improve the quality of, ethical standards in our youth. And also it is important that these standards are also observed at the public level in our public institutions. And SHRAJ is also responsible for implementation of this National Anti-Corruption Plan. Unfortunately, a lot of the institutions which are supposed to participate in its implementation are not cooperating with SHRAJ. For example, the district assemblies, there are about 397 participating agencies, that are supposed to be mainstreaming the anti-corruption agenda into their agencies, especially the district assemblies and so on. But the latest report by SHRAJ as to how it has been able to implement the plan shows that there isn't enough cooperation from most of the district assemblies, and there isn't any sanction being imposed on the heads of these institutions for lack of cooperation. So the problem we have is that there has developed a culture of impunity, and because of the weak accountability mechanism that we have in this country, corruption seems to thrive, and there isn't any serious attempt to impose sanctions and to elevate the standard of ethical values among the youth and as well as amongst people who are in the public service. That is something that we have to address very seriously.
Justice, you have called for conduct of public officers bill, that civil society groups, everybody must come on board to get this bill passed. Help us, where have we reached as far as that bill is concerned?
Well, this is a bill, it's called the Conduct of Public Officers Bill 2013.
2013?
Well, yes, and we're in 2019. So it's been pending for the last 6 years. It was discussed last, so far as I'm aware, in 2015 in Parliament. It's a very important piece of anti-corruption legislation because the bill deals with 3 issues or components of anti-corruption, namely assets declaration, gifts, and conflict of interest. Now, assets declaration is extremely important, and the legal regime for assets declaration presently is very weak, in the sense that public officers are mandated to declare that certain public officers of a certain level are obliged to declare their assets and liabilities when they take up office, and after that every 4 years, and when they leave office. But there is no method of ensuring that public officers have done so, that they have declared their assets at the stipulated periods, and there is no mechanism for ensuring that even those who have declared, they have declared truthfully their assets and liabilities. In other words, nobody has the mandate to check the veracity of the declarations. So the legal regime is very weak, and it facilitates grand corruption. People at the top can easily, when they take office, illegally acquire wealth and build houses or engage in all kinds of illegal acquisition of wealth, and then they can allege that they acquired that wealth before they took office. Because unless you have been able to get them to declare their assets when they took up office, it is very difficult for you to be able to know that the wealth that they have now was wealth that they had before they assumed office. So it is important to have a strong legal regime for assets declaration, one that would ensure that an individual, let's say the Auditor General or SHRAJ, is mandated to check the veracity of the declaration, and the declaration is either published in the national dailies or in the Gazette, and also somebody to check that at the various intervals when they are supposed to submit the declaration, they have done so. Now, this bill seeks to improve the situation by, for example, making it an offense if it is discovered that you have not filed your declaration, and also if you file a false declaration, it makes it an offense, which is punishable by a fine and or imprisonment, you see. So this bill, if it is passed, would strengthen the legal regime on assets declaration. The bill also seeks to bring clarity to the concept of conflict of interest. Under Article 284 of the Constitution, public officers should not engage in any action which put themselves in a situation of conflict of interest. In other words, they should not act in a manner where their personal interest conflicts with the performance of their public office. Okay. Now there is much confusion or misunderstanding of what constitutes conflict of interest. Recently, you may recall that the public procurement agency, the head of that institution, was suspended because there was an allegation that by this investigative journalist Manasseh Awoni, that the head had awarded contracts to a company that he had formed, 14 contracts, and that some of those contracts were being sold to other institutions, and the investigative journalist had secretly applied to buy one of these contracts. Okay? Now, there are some who think that if, for example, I'm the head of an institution and the institution is awarding a contract, I can bid for the contract provided I don't take part in the deliberations for awarding the contract. Now, this bill will bring clarity to that situation, because I take the view, and in fact, Shraj, based on the guidelines that we introduced in 2006, take the view that that should not be the case. You cannot indulge in insider dealing. In other words, awarding a contract to a company that you have formed, it is what we call insider dealing. In other words, you are dealing with yourself. You are benefiting from your position in the institution, you see. But there are some people who think that there's nothing wrong with it, provided you declare your interest and you do not take part in the deliberations in which the award of the contract is discussed, you see. So having a legislation to clarify this issue would be helpful, and it would enable us avoid a lot of the situations which has occurred recently, the allegations of conflict of interest against certain public officers. The bill also deals with gifts. What are acceptable gifts and what are...
I've realized you have a copy of the bill here.
Yes, I do.
For the purpose of my viewers, help us to understand what are the issues in there and how do we get it done, but help us understand the key issues in this public officials.
As I said, the key issues are, one, it talks about first of all, it talks about the assets to be declared. Your assets to be declared by public officers are movable and immovable assets, trust or family property in respect of which the public officer has a beneficial interest, business interests, securities, bank balances, bonds and treasury bills, jewelry or objects or arts of the value of 1,000 Ghana cedis, insurance policies, and so on. So it gives a list of the assets which you are to declare, because there was some in the Constitution, it doesn't talk about the kind of assets that you have to declare. So this bill seeks to give clarity to the kind of assets you have to declare. And then a very important provision in this bill is that if after you make your declaration, you acquire a property, which if you had had that property before you made the declaration, you would have had to declare it, then the presumption is that you acquired that property by a bribe or illegally, unless you can prove that you acquired the property legally. In other words, there is a presumption that if you acquire property after you have made a declaration which was not in your declaration, then the presumption is that you have acquired it illegally unless you can demonstrate that you have acquired it lawfully. Now, this is a provision that generated heated debate in Parliament when this bill was discussed in 2015, you see. But it's an important provision because it is the kind of provision that is used in countries like Hong Kong and Singapore to ensure that if you are living beyond your means, in other words, you are living a lifestyle which cannot be justified by your salary or your income or whatever assets you have, then there is a presumption in law that you have acquired part of your assets by bribery or illegally. And therefore, in law, the presumption, the obligation or the onus is on you to prove that you acquired that property lawfully. Now, this is was a controversial provision when the bill was discussed, and it was one of the reasons I think why up to now the bill has not been passed. You see, and then there is also a section on gifts. It talks about the kind of gifts which public officers can accept and gifts that they cannot accept. For example, you should not solicit a gift or an advantage that has the potential of influencing you in the performance of your official duties, you know. And it also has a section which talks about acceptable gifts, gifts which are acceptable. In other words, the public officer may accept any of the following gifts where the gift does not reasonably appear to influence or result in the influence of the performance of the public officer's functions. An unsolicited souvenir that does not exceed the value prescribed by regulations, and then a gift from a relative on the basis only of that relationship, a reduced membership or other fee for being a member of a professional body, and then a gift or benefit from the business employment of a spouse if that gift or benefit is extended to other families and has not been offered on the basis of a public officer's function. So it gives a list of the kind of gifts you can accept, but others that you cannot accept. And where you are faced with a gift, it tries to assist public officers to decide whether it is a lawful gift or it's a permissible gift or not. And then also, as I said, the bill deals with conflict of interest, avoidance of conflict of interest, and what you have to do when you find yourself in a situation where you have acted in a manner which puts you in a position where your personal interest has conflicted with the performance of your official duties. You know, so it's an important bill which, if passed, would help in the fight against corruption.
Now that leads me to my next, 2013, this is 2019, yes. And you keep saying if we get it passed, What do we need to do to get it passed?
Well, we have to put pressure on Parliament to get it passed. The Ghana Integrity Initiative, the Ghana Anti-Corruption Coalition, Occupy Ghana, all these institutions have been urging Parliament to pass the bill. But because there are controversial provisions in the bill, and some of these provisions are going to implicate certain public officials when it is passed. You know, they pose a threat to certain public officials. So it appears to me that there is some amount of reluctance to pass the bill because of the potential threat that it poses to certain people in public office. So it is for us to put pressure on Parliament and the government, because the ruling government has the majority in Parliament. So if the executive is actually committed to the fight against corruption, it should be in the forefront of ensuring that this bill is passed as quickly as possible. You know, but of course,
Justice, I would like you to look straight into this camera and make this appeal to all those who are watching us that this bill should not and cannot continue waiting. So talk to somebody through this camera for me.
Well, I'm appealing to the government and I'm appealing to Parliament to ensure that this bill, the Conduct of Public Officers Bill 2013, should be passed as quickly as possible, because it is a critical and important bill which will assist in the fight against corruption, because it deals with three critical areas in facilitating corruption, which is conflict of interest, assets declaration, and gifts which are permissible and gifts which are not permissible. These are areas where we have seen a lot of ambiguity and also a lack of clarity on all of these three areas. And so it is extremely important that Parliament passes this bill, and so that it can help in the fight against corruption.
Thank you. This is What is Next, and I'm in conversation with Justice Francis Emile Short. Justice, do we have any political situation that can help us set a new national agenda on matters of transparency and accountability?
A political situation like
setting foundation advantages that moving into the future can help us do things differently. You started mentioning some countries and what they've been able to do. Do we have some foundation situation grounds that we can build on moving into the future for kind of national reorientation matters of transparency and accountability?
Well,
is there hope?
Yes, I think there are a lot of lessons we can learn from a country like Singapore. I mentioned that Lee Kuan Yew, the Prime Minister of Singapore, when he became Prime Minister, 30 years ago, he decided to ensure that his country is transformed very fast. And one of the strategies he adopted was to address corruption in a very aggressive manner. He has written a book called From Third World to First World, and in one chapter called Clean Government, he discusses the strategies that he adopted. The first strategy that he adopted was to establish an anti-corruption agency within his own office, the Prime Minister's office, and he made sure that that agency was equipped with strong powers of arrest, search and arrest, powers to prosecute, powers to investigate bank accounts of people who were suspected of corruption, and so on. And then, most importantly, he ensured that the focus of attention of that agency should be on people in government, especially people we describe as the big takers. In other words, ministers, people occupying high offices. Okay? That was his focus of attention. And so I'll give you two examples. There was a minister in his government who went on a vacation with his family to Indonesia. The cost of the vacation was paid for by a businessman, okay, which was not permissible. So immediately he came back. Lee Kuan Yew made sure that he was arrested, he was prosecuted and sent to jail. His own minister. He made sure that he adopted a zero tolerance for corruption, and he implemented the policy. You know, he made sure that he did not make exemption for anybody, especially his own people, his own ministers. There was another minister that was being investigated by this agency for accepting a bribe. The minister approached the cabinet secretary. He wanted to see Lee Kuan Yew, the prime minister. Lee Kuan Yew refused to see him, to give audience to him, because he knew that he wanted to see him to try and interfere with the investigation. He refused to see him. Do you know what happened? The minister was so ashamed, he committed suicide.
Oh.
And this was published. It sent such a strong signal to his own ministers and to others that this was someone who was determined to implement his policy of zero tolerance for corruption. So the investigative agency also prosecuted a lot of high public officers on corruption, and it had a high rate of convictions and success, okay? The next policy that he adopted was a policy of meritocracy. He decided that appointments to state institutions will be based not on political patronage, not on nepotism, but on meritocracy, that people who were competent, no matter whether they belong to his party or not, are the people who he would appoint to occupy the headship for state institutions. And that ensured that the institutions functioned very efficiently, okay? What we see in our country is that and this is the winner takes all system, appointments are made by the party in office to party supporters, party relatives, political relatives of the president or people in public office, and invariably they are not necessarily made on the basis of merit. And so what happens is that sometimes you have people who are appointed to head certain institutions who are not competent to hold those positions, and so the institution becomes weak. So the appointments which are not based on meritocracy then results in weak institutions. So, but Lee Kuan Yew made sure that irrespective of the political affiliation of somebody, he made sure that he got the best brains to occupy state institutions. That is something that we can emulate. If our leaders are prepared to select people from different political parties and people who do not belong to their political parties, because they are competent, they have integrity, they are disciplined, to occupy sensitive positions in the public sphere, especially oversight institutions, we would ensure that we have strong institutions.
Strong institutions. Viewers, so soon we have to end somewhere. But maybe the next 2-3 seconds, your last word for my viewers.
Well, I would like viewers to know that it is important that each and every one of us become part of the fight against corruption. It is a collective effort, and citizens should be prepared to report incidents of corruption to the appropriate authorities. Citizens should not involve in corrupting themselves, and I think that it is important that we put pressure on government to hold accountable those who are indulging in corruption, because at the moment there is a perception of impunity, especially by persons at the higher level who engage in corruption. And so I think that we need to try and avoid this culture of impunity which has developed in our country. And so citizens must put pressure on government to make sure that they do away with this culture of impunity and hold persons accountable, especially those who occupy high public office. So this is the plea that I would make. And also I think that it's important that we have a situation where the moral and ethical values in our society are enhanced. I think that as we talked about the moral decadence in society at the moment, that is an area that we should address, and address very seriously.
Viewers, this is what is next. I've been in conversation with Justice Francis Emile Short on issues of transparency and accountability. He has been a symbol of anti-corruption, and he gives me impression that we have a long way to go as a country, but it is a collective responsibility. We will come your way same time next week. I am your regular host, Kwabena Opuni Frimpong. This is GTV, the authentic and the trusted voice of Ghana. Justice, we are so grateful to you.
It's
Thank you
pleasure.
for coming.
My pleasure.